If you want to get paid doctor money, ask questions like a doctor. And if you want to ask the right type of doctor questions when you're just some random salesperson, how can I ask that type of a question? I'm not a trusted medical doctor. I didn't go to medical school. I'm just a salesperson. How can I ask deeply personal questions? This episode is a guide on a variety of techniques to be able to do just that. Welcome, everyone, to the Close More Sales podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to talk about the delicate art of posing challenging questions without alienating your prospects, without triggering them in a way that raises sales resistance. We're going to give you actionable advice and real techniques to start asking the questions that you wish you were able to give you the answers that will help you lock up the deal. Maybe you're familiar with the phrase, to get paid doctor money, you need to ask questions like a doctor. But you may be thinking, how am I supposed to do that? I'm not a trusted medical doctor. I didn't go to medical school. I'm just a salesperson. How can I ask deeply personal questions? Questions about someone's why, about their motivation, about their hesitation, about their pain, if I'm just some salesperson. This episode is a guide on a variety of techniques to be able to do just that. To ask the tough questions in a way that doesn't trigger your prospects or raise any sales resistance whatsoever. These are detailed tactics I usually reserve to tell and coach salespeople that I'm coaching one-on-one or for members of our community, but I'm going to be sharing it publicly here. But first, why should you listen to this show? Heck, what's even the purpose of this podcast? Our purpose, the purpose of this show, is to empower sales professionals and entrepreneurs to push themselves to grow, achieve unimaginable success without burning out, and ultimately transform their lives. I'm Ian Ross, and I am obsessed with all things sales. And I work with teams across the country to make more money by asking better questions. The most proven path to achieving financial freedom is maximizing your earning potential. And a sales role is the lowest barrier with the highest possible ceiling for entry onto that path. Anyone can become a killer salesperson with the right techniques, what we're going over today, the right mindset, and consistency. Everything we cover on this podcast, it is geared towards one thing: helping you close more sales so that you can live the life you want. This is a newer podcast, though. We are in the growth stage. So if you get any value from this episode today, follow, subscribe, let us know either in the comments on YouTube or in a review where you listen to podcasts. Tell us what it is you got out of the show. Because if you have conversations where how well you speak determines how much money you can make, you're in a sales role. And if you'd like to get better at what you do, text CLOSE, CLOSE, to 33777, and we'll see if we can help you out along the process. Again, today's theme, posing those challenging questions, asking the toughest questions in sales. So I want to give a little context here. In my first commission-only sales role, I was selling life insurance. There's a question I had to ask, or at least that I wanted to ask in the script. It wasn't exactly phrased this way in the script for the company, but I made some adjustments and wanted to ask this question because I had to try and get to the root of this. Life insurance is a very pain-focused sale, and it exists in the abstract. For most people, they will never see the benefits of their life insurance. It's truly an emotional sensation that their family is covered. What was the tough question I needed to ask? Now, I am selling union members in New York City, basically. New York State was my territory, but I was in New York City, so I was selling like truck drivers in Queens and Long Island and stuff like that. Teamsters, people who didn't love being asked tough questions by salespeople. The tough question that I had to ask was, and you could tell me if you imagine this rubbing a truck driver the wrong way, what will it be like for your family if you don't come home tomorrow? Woo! That is a tough question. And people would get understandably upset at that question if it was phrased that same way. There's a variety of techniques that you can do to soften the blow, to make it so that you can go into these pain, why, how bad could it be, all these deep questions with someone without making them go, what kind of a question is that? That's none of your business. How dare you ask me that? Who do you think you are? You shouldn't get any of that if you do this appropriately. So, the first thing to think about in the challenge of deep inquiry, asking a question that feels like there's that fine line that a salesperson often walks in between the need for like learning in-depth information about the prospect and the risk of overstepping personal boundaries, of making someone say, how dare you ask me that? So, my personal journey there is I offended people with the nature of that question when I was asking about what will it be like for their families if they don't come home tomorrow. An adjustment I made was in two main parts, which I can talk about. Uh, we'll get into this because there's a bunch of different tactics I'm going to cover on this episode today. I use two main things of these tactics to get a hold of people. So the first thing I did is what I'm going to cover here in that first segment, which is using strategic phrases to sort of soften the ask. A perfect example of this in my questioning is there are certain turns of phrase, there's certain things you can say that are almost like a hack. They're being thrown a lifeline to being able to dig a little bit deeper. And so instead of saying, what's it going to be like for your family if you don't come home tomorrow? I would say, you know, thank you for all that you've shared with me so far. If you don't mind me asking, have you thought about what it's going to be like for your family if that worst day happens and you're unable to come home tomorrow? When I made an adjustment, it seems so obvious. What did I do there? It's the same question. I never got that same pushback again. Now, people might say that's a tough question. Boy, whew, I had someone cry when I asked that question the right way, but they weren't mad at me. Their sales resistance didn't go up. They engaged with the question the exact way I wanted them to, which is actually answering it live for me in a way that extracts the motivation to make purchasing life insurance justified. So there's a few things you can do. Like, for instance, here, we all want to ask why questions. We talk about why all the time, someone's why do you want to do this? Here's an example here of when I was coaching a team on this. When you ask a why question, you run the risk of people getting defensive in a way that could be to your disadvantage, depending on where you are in the sales process. The example I can give here, it's perfectly relevant. I was training some disruptors, lead managers. These were people, we were contacting homeowners about potentially purchasing their home. Now, they have ideally already raised their hands saying they wanted to sell their home, right? In this exact setup, by the time the lead manager was talking to them, this was not a cold call out of the blue necessarily, but it's still pretty early on in the process. We asked the question, why do you want to sell your home? That's not inherently a bad question, even though a why question can be not ideal because someone gets defensive. They defend the answer. And think about it. If you can think back to the why questions you heard growing up, you often had to defend yourself. Why isn't your homework done? Why haven't you cleaned your room? Those why questions are accusatory in nature, and many people still feel a version of that sensation by being asked why. It's almost too upfront and aggressive. So, even though theoretically we are strategic, we wanted them to ask that question, why do you want yourself to sell your home? Because the defense of that would be in our favor, right? So we still trying to trigger that. It was still early enough in the sales process that our lead managers, partially because they weren't amazingly trained at that time, or at least not consistently, because that sort of was an entry role for us at Disruptors. And also just by the very nature of just not being able to execute early on in the conversation, we're getting pushback. Why do you want to know that? What does that have to do with purchasing my home? Like, why are you asking me that? People got defensive in response to that question. We made some pretty basic adjustments in terms of the specifics of the language. Instead of, why do you want to sell your home? We switched it to, what has you considering selling your home now? It seems pretty minor, but that feeling that those homeowners, the prospects for us, were experiencing with the question completely went away. Now, there's a couple things you can do. I mean, theoretically, if you're intentional with your tonality and you're well skilled, you could still ask, why do you want to sell your home? But we still got the same type of answer with the what oriented question without risking that sensation of someone going, how dare you want to know that? So that's a really, really key point here that I want to emphasize is thinking strategically about what you can say, the what of when you're asking a question, the actual words themselves to make sure you don't trigger sales resistance or at least upset your prospect in any way, shape, or form. So, in my earlier example, when I was talking to those truck drivers about their family, if they don't come home tomorrow, I did a few things. One of my favorite lines, which all of you should start implementing almost immediately, is the, if you don't mind me asking. I don't know why. That's a super hack of a line. If you don't mind me asking, for some reason, makes people who would have minded you asking, by you saying it, helps ease that resistance and ease that frustration. There have been times where I have forgotten to ask, if you don't mind me asking, at the start of a question, which is usually where I recommend it, and even thrown it in at the end, at the tail end of the question, simply to make sure it didn't come off too aggressively. In addition to, if you don't mind me asking, one of the default phrases or additional couple words you can add is, I'm curious. Man, I don't know why that helps either. I mean, the very nature of asking a question almost implies curiosity, but by prefacing a tougher question with, I'm curious, it helps gently open the prospect up to deeper dialogue. So, for instance, exploring it a little bit deeper could be, I'm curious, you're in the process of talking to a bunch of people. How will you know if you found what you're looking for? That is a much easier question for someone to answer than, how will you know if you found what you're looking for? Adding a couple little words at the start helps soften the blow. There's huge power in softening the blow a little bit. I refer to this as like rounding the edges of a question. If the question could have some sort of sharp edges on it because it's why oriented, it's about someone's motivation, it's about someone's pain, about someone's family, I want to make sure those edges aren't too sharp. So that's a really key technique to think of. The power of these phrases is in making prospects comfortable. They feel comfortable in inviting their honest responses to your question. So looking for additional phrases like this that you could say at the start to soften the blow of the question is just huge. Another thing I love to do, which is an extension of this same idea, I refer to this as as like the honey technique. Why do I call it that? You can tell I have kind of a sore throat right now. Apologies to those of you listening only via audio and not seeing my beautiful face. I'm sure that's frustrating. I know I can find that annoying. In that same idea, if you have a sore throat and you're trying to take a big horse-sized pill, it can hurt going down. An easier way to take the pill is to drizzle it in honey. If you put honey on the pill, it makes swallowing it that much easier. So the honey technique is basically an emphasizing of some acknowledgement and validation of your prospect before posing your question. What is an example of this? When I am talking to business owners about questions around revenue. Now, to be fair, I sell sales training most of the time. I sell other things as well, but most of my time is around getting an individual or someone's sales team more effective, doing better. And so I want their answers to be guided towards that. However, I can't force someone to tell me, can't force a business owner to tell me that they have a sales problem if they don't. So I want to make sure it feels like their idea and ask a question where they can reveal to me this is something they would need. But it can somehow rub people the wrong way if I'm just asking too direct a question in this same attempt. So something I love to do, and I've done this for so many different prospects in many different industries. But an example I'm using right now is, hey, you know your business. You know your business far better than I ever could. If there's one thing about it that if you improved it first, you feel like would give you outsized results, would give you a better return if you fix this first, what do you think that would be? So where was the honey in that technique? The drizzling of the honey was in the you know your business far better than I ever could. I've done that when talking to realtors or when talking to homeowners, whatever. Hey, you know this area better than I could. Hey, you've been in this house 20 years. You know this neighborhood better than I could. You know this better than me. You've got probably a better understanding of your family and their dynamics than I ever could. I love this honey drizzle technique because it's not a overly salesperson-y compliment. It's not like, oh my gosh, it's yours. You're so strong. You have spinach. You're like Popeye. It's nothing extreme. It's almost like a throwaway line that I do before introducing the next question. The power in it, though, is that someone has the sensation, "Mom, I'm going to swallow this pill," that theoretically the answering of swallowing this pill could be in my favor. I don't even notice that pill I swallowed, my answer will be in the favor of this salesperson. So to make sure I mask that idea, I drizzle honey on it with a tiny little validation or compliment or acknowledgement of their expertise that makes them feel more comfortable in answering the question. Now, what's clear here, I don't like to give up frame. This is a thing that's talked about by plenty of salespeople. This is not giving up frame. This is not saying, I'm not an important salesperson. I have no ability. I have no expertise. It's truly reserved for things that theoretically that person should have a better understanding of. And it's acknowledging that. It's putting honey on that. If someone has lived on that block for 30 years, I don't care how much you know about real estate, that person understands that block better than you do. All I'm doing is calling them out and giving them a little bit of authority and autonomy in the way I call it out before switching to my next question. It makes them feel more comfortable answering it rather than going, no, I'm the smart realtor. I'm the brilliant investor. I know this area better than anyone else. You don't know what you're talking about. Your house is going to be worth this much. That's too confrontational. You're butting heads by the very nature of declaring that type of expertise. Instead, I can maintain my frame, which is my authority and my status, by adhering to my process. As long as I'm sticking to my process, hey, I wish I could do that for you. My process has something a little bit different. That doesn't work for you. That's totally okay. My frame, my status as an effective, important person whose time is valuable is not being wasted there. All I'm doing is drizzling a little honey before they swallow the pill. And I love this approach. So it fosters also just like a more positive environment in general. It makes it easier for that person answering because they just got a tiny little ego boost, even if it's just so minor, to then delve into potentially a more challenging subject. So start incorporating this, almost immediately. It helps improve rapport and trust. It will never build real rapport. It will never build real trust, but it helps improve it and make sure it's solidified along the way. This is huge. So look for this. Look for opportunities to do this. Don't do it excessively because then they'll be like, why is this person complimenting me all the time? But if I want to ask a question that theoretically is open-ended enough, like, what do you have to fix about your business? That they might be like, you're making me do extra work here. Like, you're going to make me think about this. You're just calling me in the middle of the day. I want to make sure before I give them the work of thinking about what they could fix in their business first. You'd be surprised how many business owners aren't actively thinking about this. And the ones that are also probably thinking about it wrong. But if I'm going to make you do that work, let me give you a little bit of an ego boost first and drizzle some honey on that pill. The next technique, which is so powerful as well, and I've talked about this in the past, is a version of active listening and a recap of what you just heard. I won't go too deep into this because I've covered this on a previous episode not too long ago. But if you can actively listen to what was just said to you and do a brief strategic recap of what you just heard before moving on to that pain oriented question, it sets the stage for the prospect to feel heard and understood. So, incorporating some type of summary of a prospect's points as a bridge to move into a more sensitive inquiry will enhance that feeling of like, oh, this is actually a respectful conversation. It's not just a plow ahead, let me move you through the sale process. They'll feel heard and understood. An example of that same point could be if someone's recapping some challenges they've been having with business partners about getting them on board with, shifting to a new market. I want to make sure before I ask about the impact there that that person feels like I've heard that challenge. So by engaging my active listening skills, I will do a very brief recap and immediately move that into the tougher question. So, for instance, and this is truly off the top of my head because I have prepared this question in advance, but I've done this enough times that I can do this off the top of my head. If someone were saying, yeah, they were talking all about their business partners don't see the value in, let's say, Louisiana. This is picked out of just off the top of my head, going into Louisiana market for what we do, even though that person thinks there's tons of value there because it's an underutilized market. My recap before asking that tougher question could be like, yeah, it sounds like they've got sort of maybe an outdated view of thinking about Louisiana as a state, and you are aware that there's real potential there that could be mined. That being said, if you're not going to be able to get buy-in from your partners there, how are you planning on proceeding? Is this something you're even going to try and prioritize, or are you just going to go, oh, there's no way I can even go into Louisiana without their buy-in, even though you can make a bunch of money? That is a very powerful question. And that the way I phrased that was a recapping of things that they said were important to them. I actively listened in this hypothetical situation I made up and recapped it in my own words so that they felt like I was really listening and I understood their hesitation before asking a question about what if there's a disagreement with your business partners? I guess there's no way you can make money then, right? Like I'm starting to go deeper into a challenge that if I had just asked that outright, what if your business partners aren't on board? Well, then I guess I'm not doing it. What kind of a question is that? Who are you? I don't know you. You're some sales guy. That type of resistance goes away when you incorporate all of the tactics that I'm covering on this episode. So start incorporating this yourself and some version of summaries specifically of the prospect's pain points that will help you bridge into those more sensitive areas. So look out for those, actively listen as you go through it. There's another tactic that I love that I don't hear talked about too much, which is this idea. It's something I refer to as closing off before opening up. Hopefully, you are familiar as a salesperson, as a professional, with this idea of asking open ended questions. Now, you might have some in your script that you were trained on or something you were given that gives you decent results. So, a classic example of an open ended question might be, what made you want to take this call today? Or uh, if this is a problem you had to fix tomorrow, what do you think would need to happen? Right? These are open ended questions, meaning they don't give me yes or no answers. They have to think and give me longer answers to explain the motivation behind it. They have to spend some time answering that question. In sales, we almost always want to be asking open-ended questions. If you are asking closed-ended questions, or even worse, asking an open-ended question and closing it off, meaning you ask the question, uh, if this is a problem you had to fix tomorrow, you feel like something big would need to happen, right? Right? Like adding a thing that closes it off or adding the worst of all, yes or no, right? Forcing someone to close it is a terrible mistake. However, sometimes if you're asking a really tough question, for instance, what's it going to be like for your family if you don't come home tomorrow? I don't want to upset the person by just asking that question directly. So I will start with a closed off version of that question to introduce the sensitive topic, followed then by an invitation to expand upon that initial response. So rather than asking a potentially triggering question around someone's really sensitive topic, like if they got divorced and the kids and where they fall in that divorce, I would close it off to make it easier to answer first. So, for instance, or if I were going to say, what's going to happen with the kids in this house now that you and your wife are getting divorced? Man, none of your business. What kind of question is that? Like, even if they answer it, it's going to make them feel like, oh, that's a man. I don't like that question. That makes me feel bad. You're calling out my divorce. What am I? You saying I'm a failed father? Like all those sensations could happen to a prospect if I ask it too directly. So closing off before opening up is usually like, have you had a conversation with your wife about what it's going to look like in terms of where the kids go after you guys sell this home? And then he says, yeah, we talked about it. And I go, okay. If you don't mind me asking, how did that conversation go? I'm getting to the same answer as that first question, but it helps make it easier for them to answer. Another one that might be more relevant to you right now could be rather than talking directly about someone's budget or about the price. Hey, what's your budget here? Whoa, man, I don't want to reveal that, right? They might either don't want to answer you or they could potentially lie. Instead of that type of question, I will ask a closed off question intentionally to get them going. And it's the same idea of what I just said. So, for instance, have you had a conversation with your wife around what you were thinking it would make sense to pay for this? Yeah, we talked about it. Okay. If you don't mind me asking, how did that conversation go? Right? Whenever there's a topic, and you can do the work yourself as a salesperson of where it is in your process, you're getting that level of resistance where you wish you weren't. Whatever it is, whatever you're selling, whatever you're doing, there's probably some point where you're like, man, I can feel some resistance at this point, but I need to know this information. Even though we want to be asking open ended questions all the time, an easy way to make it so that the prospect feels comfortable answering is to ask a closed off question and then an open ended one about that closed off question right away. So look for that. Like, have you had a conversation about that? Another example, if you can also even use that to insert doubt for someone. So, for instance, if I'm training acquisitions managers in a wholesaling company trying to buy houses off market, and we want to insert some doubt about whether or not it makes sense to go with a realtor in this exact instance for whatever reason, instead of just saying or telling the prospect why they don't want to go with a realtor or telling them all the negative things there, I can ask an intentionally closed off question that makes it easy to answer. So, for instance, did that realtor you met with, did they have a conversation with you around what you're actually going to be walking away with after you pay closing costs and commissions and all that? And they're like, oh, no, they haven't. Gotcha. Would it surprise you to learn that it's not going to be the number that you see there? In fact, it could be quite less, right? These are intentionally closed off questions. Those are yes, no questions. But I'm introducing tough topics by making them closed off on purpose. You will only ever hear me asking a question where yes or no makes sense as the answer if I'm being very strategic about it. It does not happen by accident. And there's a key point here, which is that I am intentional about what I say. And if you are in sales, which is where how well you speak determines how much money you make, you're in sales, you should be intentional as well. There's not a I hesitate to give people too much advice sometimes, specifically if it's not requested. Now, if you're listening to this podcast, theoretically, you're open to learning and wanting some advice on getting better. But even still, the only thing I still live by about this general belief is that I don't want to tell people what they should or have to do. I will simply make suggestions on ways that I think it could be done better, easier, more efficiently. Not that you have to do this. If you want to do something differently, you're welcome to, right? All that being said, the only point I will always tell every single salesperson they should do without a doubt is be intentional. Be intentional with what you say. And also, leading into my next point, be intentional with how you say it. So, another thing I introduced that helps ease that sales resistance is tonality, is being very conscious of how I am saying what I'm saying. So, my preferred tonality when asking a question, plenty of people talk about this in a variety of different ways. I have a specific name I give this tone, and I give it for a very precise reason. The tonality that I like to ask these types of questions in, especially these intense questions, I refer to as the curious skeptic tonality. Now, I'm sure you've all understood this idea that how you ask a probing question matters. But why do I have such a weird name as the curious skeptic tone when I'm trying to express genuine interest without seeming judgmental? The curious skeptic tonality it's titled that way for a very specific reason. Plenty of people talk about being curious, having a curious tone. The reason I add the skeptic part is to differentiate something really, really important. For the curious skeptic, I am not skeptical of the prospect. I am skeptical of my own understanding. This sounds weird. Like, what's the point of this? I really want to hammer this point home. I am thinking I am really curious and I am skeptical, but I'm skeptical of my understanding of what they're telling me. I'm skeptical about my own curiosity. It's like almost a loop in terms of my tone. And I try and express that with how I say what I'm saying. So I know it maybe sounds superficial or weird or like, well, can't I just sound curious? Sure. I like to think about it through, I want to sound like a curious skeptic. And what I'm skeptical of is my own understanding. And I think about that intentionally when I'm asking these questions. So going back to the original question that I talked about, where I had to ask something really tough to get someone to open up. What's it going to be like for your family if you don't come home tomorrow? What did I say? I say, if you don't mind me asking, have you thought about what it's going to be like for your family if the worst happens and you don't actually come home tomorrow? I did a few things. First, I rounded the edges a little bit, saying, if you don't mind me asking. I then made it a question that theoretically they could answer yes or no to. So I kind of closed it off, but I did it in a way where the very nature of it, it's still going to be they're still going to answer like it's open-ended, but I made it sound easier for them to answer. Rather than, what's it going to be like for your family? Have you thought about what it's going to be like for your family if the worst happens and you don't come home tomorrow? Have you thought about theoretically, the answer is a yes or a no. Now, if they go, I've thought about it, I can go, okay, and how's that gone? Talk to me a little bit about, or would you mind just sharing me a little bit about what your thoughts are there? And the last thing I added is my tonality. I am curious and I am skeptical of my own understanding in this. It's a huge part of asking these questions. If you just see the transcript of this episode, first off, you're probably better off not hearing my scratchy voice of me recovering from this cold. However, You are also missing the nuances of how I say what I'm saying. I'm talking a lot about the what, but how I say, not just what I say, is everything. So these are the points that I want to talk about. Like, if you can think about it, like making sure that you are rounding off the edges of tough questions, use practical application of these techniques of, if you don't mind me asking, I'm curious, would you be willing to share with me? Something like that. Also, potentially closing off a tough question on purpose in a way that makes it easier for them to answer. Drizzling honey on the pill if I need to. Hey, you know your family better than I could. Have you thought about what it's going to be like for them if you don't come home tomorrow? And also being really intentional about how I sound, looking to be careful and considerate with my tone. So, if you want to be in pursuit of getting better at asking these tough questions, of asking the questions a doctor would need to ask to get paid like a doctor, you absolutely can start incorporating these immediately. However, instead of incorporating everything at once on your sales call this afternoon or tomorrow or whatever, the best way to start introducing these ideas is to do one at a time and do it over a week. That's a good enough amount of time. So start with making sure wherever you are in your sales conversation, in your script, whatever you're doing, when you have that tough question, just introduce, if you don't mind me asking, and I'm curious. Just introduce those first. Do that consistently for a week. And then be even more intentional about your tone when you say it. Maybe also explore the idea the week after that of closing off a question to then open it up, right? Like, look for ways to do this incrementally. Don't change everything immediately overnight like that, or you're going to run the risk of not doing any of it. And if you want to get some guidance, some help on strategically exactly how to do that, how to start asking the toughest questions in sales so that your prospects reveal to you their pain, their motivation, their timeline, all the things that, if only I could have a checklist of what's really going on, I could actually sell my product, but people are closed off because they don't want to answer my questions. If you want to get better at that, whether it's about their budget, whether it's about their timeline, or it's about what it's going to be like for their family, if God forbid the worst happens and they don't come home tomorrow, text close to 33777. I would love to have a conversation with you about what that can look like. So, soften your phrases. Use active listening to recap some of what you just heard. Use appropriate tonality at every single step of the way. The confused skeptic tone is my favorite for asking these tougher questions. And start drizzling honey on those tougher questions to make the pill easier to swallow. And you will start getting your prospects to reveal information to you that they would have been hesitant to reveal before. Don't be afraid to be intentional about closing off a question on purpose before opening it up if you're getting resistance there. So, that said, I'd love to invite you, the listener or viewer, however you're engaging with this podcast, share with us either on YouTube or in a review where you're listening to podcasts. Tell us about some of your own successes in asking tougher questions. And let me know what questions you have. I want to start engaging with the audience a little bit more rather than just talking into a vacuum here. Let me know what you need help with. What do you want me to do an episode on? Who do you want as a guest? Start reaching out and engaging with people you think would make good guests on this show, or just topics you want me to cover. I'm happy to listen to the audience to make sure prepare an episode that can deal with exactly with what you need help with right now. Because the biggest thing, I cannot emphasize this enough, sure, there's an aspect of the knowledge of how to be a great salesperson, how to ask the right questions, how to dive deep, how to sound the right way. That's valuable. The most valuable thing is in the gap between the information and where you are right now. Closing that gap is where all the value is. It is not necessarily in the information itself. So, whatever you need to help close that gap, let me know in the comments or in a review. I will make sure to prioritize preparing an episode on that topic for you. If you want to get paid doctor money, ask questions like a doctor. And if you want to ask the right type of doctor questions when you're just some random salesperson, how can I ask that type of a question? Start implementing these techniques and implement them incrementally over time so you can get comfortable with them rather than just snapping your fingers and doing everything differently right away. You can absolutely do this. You can absolutely crush it and ask the toughest questions imaginable if you are intentional with how you do it. I am Ian Ross. This has been the Close More Sales Podcast.